Good morning. Thanks for turning out this morning. I'm pleased to be introducing Bill Vaughn, and even more pleased to see his new book, The Last Air, available out there on the table. Bill's earlier books include Hawthorne, A Political, Cultural, and Natural History of the Tree, and First a Little Chi-Chi, and then some other extremely odd sports. Bill's articles have appeared in Outside, Men's Journal, Ski, New West, American Cowboy, Wooden Boat, Rocky Mountain Magazine, among many other publications and anthologies, including The Best American Magazine Writing 2001, Outside 25, and Dog is My Co-Pilot. The subject of his essays and reports range from sports to the paper industry, fashion, Branson, and to celebrities such as Jesse James. His essay about ice skating was nominated for a National Magazine Book Award. To read Bill's work is to come away informed, entertained, and a little less alone. In short, to be smarter, happier, and more human. Bill is co-creator and designer of the amazing and versatile food suit. Bill Kittredge gave Bill Vaughn perhaps the highest compliment any of us can hope to receive. Bill Vaughn is one of the few people I know who is actually smarter and funnier than he thinks he is, Bill said. Please join me in welcoming Bill Vaughn to the Montana Book Festival.
You talking about me? Well, good morning. Thanks for coming. People write books for all kinds of reasons, for money, obviously, for fame. Some people become obsessed with a topic. That would be me when I wrote this book about a tree I'd never known anything about. We moved downstream from Missoula, and it's infested with these spiky, ugly trees. And a friend came out and said, "What are these?" And I said, "I don't know." She said, "You own these trees. You own this place. You don't know what this tree is?" And I thought, she's right. And I became absolutely obsessed with everything about this tree to the point where I had to write a book about it. I counted every hawthorn on our 25-acre expanse of land that we share with one of our neighbors, and finished, and there were 136 hawthorns on the property. And then I realized, wait, this could be just one tree. Since they propagate by suckers, you've wasted a whole week counting trees. Finally, one of the reviewers of hawthorn said, "Hawthorn is everything you need to know about hawthorn and far more than you want to know." When I wrote this book about my wife's family on both sides, her name is Kitty Heron. She kept her name, obviously, since it's a better name in Montana than Vaughn, which is sort of trashy if you go back a generation or two. I wrote this book about her family because I liked her mother-in-law, which is the weirdest reason I can think of for writing a book. And it was kind of a post-mortem gift to her. And we had a lot in common. We both went to the same journalism school. She actually became a reporter. She was the first female reporter to work for the United Press in Montana. And she was instrumental in covering the aftermath of the Man Gulch fire, which killed 11 firefighters. So she worked as an actual reporter. We both went to journalism school for exactly the same reason. We both thought it would be the easiest thing to do. She said later in life, what's there to do? What is there to do with the job of a reporter? You go to a thing, you see a car crash, you talk to a survivor, you go back to the office and you write about it. Big deal. Why do you have to go to college to do that? I said, I don't know. I barely went to college and didn't get a degree until 30 years after enrolling. That's another story. Anyway, a little backstory about this book and this chapter I'm gonna read. Kitty's great-great-grandfather, Daniel Heron, brought his family to Maryville's, Montana, from Maine in 1877. They ran a roadhouse south of Helena, and then they homesteaded around Lincoln, Montana. Did pretty good, to the effect that the sons and the father split up their partnership. And Holly Heron, her great-grandfather, got 325 acres and 20 horses and a couple hundred head of cattle. And by 1924, what was called the Heron Ranch had grown to be basically 30 square miles. It stretched all the way from Craig, Montana, on the Missouri, up the Little Prickly Pear Creek, and then all the way down the west shore of Holter Lake into the Helena Valley. So this was a serious operation, and he built on it incrementally. When land came up for sale, especially from the railroad, he bought it. He was, for someone who never graduated from high school and wasn't really educated, he was very savvy about how to make money. Anyway, so this chapter is called Wild and Woolly. Montana at the turn of the 20th century was still a rough frontier where drunken men regularly fought in the streets with their fists and sometimes their guns. On Christmas Day, 1904, while visiting Wolf Creek in his horse-drawn buggy, Holly found himself in the middle of a commotion caused by a saloon owner named M.H. Bray. After sampling his own establishment's refreshments, Bray decided to celebrate the holiday by firing shots over the heads of a group of men who had gathered around Holly to chat after he had drawn up to a hitching post. Suddenly, one of Holly's horses leapt into the air and fell down dead with a bullet in its brain. 3 years earlier, Holly had thrown himself into a public brawl on Main Street in Wolf Creek with a pair of itinerant ranch hands named Arthur L. Green and Calvin C. DeVoe. According to a local report, Holly knocked down DeVoe in the first round and knocked out Green in the second. To show that he harbored no hard feelings, Holly invited the young combatants into the Bluebird Saloon for a drink, but they declined his offer. Harlan Heron was enormously strong and barrel-chested. According to an unverified family story, at an annual gathering in Wolf Creek, he was the only man who lifted a 500-pound keg of nails from a loading dock into a boxcar without spilling a single nail. Now, I don't believe that story. I don't know why a manufacturer would put 500 pounds of nails in a barrel. Who else except Holly could lift it? I tried to find out if that was true around 1904, and I came up empty, so we'll just go with this story. On Christmas Eve of that year, several fires broke out. The Heron Ranch, destroying 2 barns, 2 sheds, 3 corrals, 4 haystacks, and 1 straw stack, property valued at $8,000 to $10,000 at the time. Neighbors who rushed to the scene and doused the flames spared Heron of even higher losses. Because of the nature of these multiple blazes, it was believed they were intentionally set. A week later, Green and DeVoe were arrested and accused of second-degree arson. Their bonds were set at $5,000 each, and they were remanded to jail in Helena till the following Monday, when they returned to court and entered pleas of not guilty. Because no evidence was presented at this hearing, an attorney tried to get Green released on a writ of habeas corpus, but the judge denied the request. In May 1902, following an 8-day trial, a jury deliberated Green's fate for 3 hours and returned a guilty verdict on the charge of arson. During the trial, the judge dismissed the charges against Calvin DeVoe, citing the state's lack of evidence, and he was set free. Green, however, was sentenced to 6 years in the state penitentiary at Deer Lodge. A self-described former school teacher born in Stratford-upon-Avon, William Shakespeare's alleged hometown, Green had served a year in prison in 1894 after pleading guilty to a burglary in Fort Benton, after several witnesses testified that he had publicly vowed to get even with Heron. In February 1903, Calvin DeVoe sued Heron and Galen, this was Holly's partner at the time, for malicious prosecution, seeking damages of $10,000. While Green began serving his sentence as attorney, E.A. Carlton was preparing to file a motion for a new trial. In August 1902, he submitted 6 affidavits to district court in Helena that described misconduct on the part of witnesses for the prosecution and 4 of the jurors. These were first-hand accounts of Heron engaged in friendly conversations with jurors at the Grand Central Hotel in Helena, where he was staying during the trial, and palling around with the prosecution's witnesses, some of whom were his employees. A reporter described in breathless tones what happened next. Last evening, just before the scores of steel bolts shooting to their places in cell doors filled the long corridors with harsh noise and announced the hour of bedtime, Green received a telegram which means a speedy goodbye to the prison and another chance for freedom, which he thought lost. Judge Henry C. Smith of the District Court signed an order today granting him another trial. And E.A. Carlton, who defended Green at his former trial, sent the message announcing the fact to the convict. Judge Smith made you a Christmas present of a new trial, the message read. Green was accused of arson by Heron. The case was hard fought. Neighboring enmities of long-standing figured strongly on the outside. The evidence was circumstantial. The court holds that it was not strong enough to justify a conviction, but strong enough to raise suspicions against the defendant. The evidence in point concerns alleged threats made by Green against Heron, who had previously beaten him. It also relates to his whereabouts last Christmas night. He claims he was in a cabin. Another witness, so says Judge Smith's order, raised doubt as to its absolute truth. The fact that Green had threatened the victim of the fire and had in his threats talked of fire, that he had, after the fire, made other statements which would tend to cast suspicion upon him. These should not have, in the opinion of the court, led to a conviction. Let me just interject something here. It's rare that if you're doing these kinds of family histories that you're going to find 300 citations in newspapers. But the fact is, the newspapers at the time covered dogfights. They covered runaway horses. Anything and everything that moved in these small communities was fodder for a reporter's notebook. And added to the fact that Holly was rich and influential, and on the Burke side of Kitty's family, her grandfather was a politician. One of his brothers was a United States senator. This is like low-hanging fruit. I mean, there was more research than I actually used. That's why I dedicated the book to the reporters, because they're so maligned most of the time. At least I gave them something back. Anyway, after Green had languished behind bars for 18 months, a second trial commenced in Helena. Green does not look the bronzed and sunburned rancher he did when tried before, a reporter observed. Instead, he is thin and his face pale. 2 weeks later, on its second vote, a unanimous jury acquitted Green of all charges, and he was released from custody. The Green case, a reporter noted, was one of the most famous of its kind ever tried in this county. In 1903, Holly Heron's net worth in today's economy would make him a millionaire several times over. Not bad for an indifferent student who never finished high school. But sometimes what makes one man rich makes another man poor. On Saturday night in August 1903, Holly and 8 other Wolf Creek area cattle ranchers, along with 20 to 30 of their neighbors and hired hands, armed themselves and covered their faces with bandanas. Under a full moon, they rode north along the Missouri. Around midnight, the gang invaded a 1,450-acre sheep ranch on the Dearborn River owned by Harry Nitsche, a 49-year-old immigrant from Germany. They tore down corrals, pennings that were penning some 2,500 head of sheep, and drove the animals through heavy brush, injuring 50 head. At gunpoint, they captured Nietzsche's French Basque sheep herder, Adelaire Desgenais, put a rope around his neck, and took him several miles away before warning him to abandon Nietzsche's sheep camp forever, or they would hang him. Nietzsche and Desgenais filed separate lawsuits against Heron and the other ranchers. Nietzsche claimed that the attack had put him out of business, forcing him to sell his holdings at a loss and depriving him of an annual profit of $1,500. In addition to the loss of income, he cited $3,000 in financial damage, plus $25 for the destruction of his provisions, bringing the total to $4,525 in restitution demanded from the white cappers. This was around $130,000 in today's purchasing power. Desgenais demanded $5,000 for his treatment at the hands of Holly and his gang, plus $250 to compensate him for the cost of moving to a safer place in Montana. Going back to white capping, the Ku Klux Klan is part of the whole white capping thing. It really involved neighbors deciding that another neighbor was a jerk. For whatever reason, either he was competing with them economically, or he was a drunk, or any number of reasons. There are actually several cases in Montana of cattle ranchers trying to drive sheep herders off the open range, which in 1904 was still in existence. It had yet to be fenced by people like Holly Heron, who would spend a fortune putting up barbed wire fences around 15 miles of the Heron Ranch. which, by the way, would be renamed in 1934 by its new owner, the famous Oxbow Ranch on Holter Lake. The defense presented 13 witnesses who verified the alibis of Holly Heron and the other defendants, all of whom claimed to be somewhere other than Nietzsche's sheep ranch the night of August 8th. One of them was home in bed. Another was 40 miles away. A third was spending the night at a neighbor's, and so on. But the jurors didn't buy this testimony, especially after hearing from S.W. Mosher, a neighbor of Nietzsche's and himself a sheepman. Mosher identified two of the masked marauders. In the end, the jury ruled in Nietzsche's favor and awarded him $716.25. The defendants immediately asked for a stay of judgment and a new trial. They based their pleading on 7 grounds, ranging from irregularity in the proceedings and misconduct of the jury. The Genet's lawsuit and Nietzsche's second attempt at a legal remedy were moved to district court in Great Falls. What were called the Augusta whitecapping cases languished there for more than 2 years before the cattleman finally settled with the sheepman out of court for undisclosed sums. It was during this period of stress brought on by his legal problems that Holly, in 1906, at the age of 43, divorced Mary Teresa Sanford, citing her desertion as the grounds for the breakup. The following year, he married Mary Ellen O'Connell, the 25-year-old daughter of Irish descent, who had settled in Marysville, Montana, after coming west from Michigan. She moved into Holly's home ranch on the left bank of the Missouri, along with her 10-year-old brother, Brian O'Connell, and her sisters, Bernice and Mabel. They had been orphaned in 1905 when their father, a 50-year-old miner named Thomas, died of what the newspaper called a lingering illness as his children gathered around his deathbed. His wife had died several years earlier, but their deaths provided Holly with another achievement, a daughter, when he adopted Mabel 4 years later. These upheavals in his family life allowed a radical change of course in Holly's business life that would have struck him as incomprehensible during his assaults on the flockmeisters. In 1905, Holly Heron decided to turn his considerable energy to raising sheep. This wasn't a decision guided by the notion that if you can't beat them, join them. Instead, it was based solely on the profit motive. Any questions? Needless to say, the Heron family has mixed reactions to this book. I was telling a couple people that I got a letter from Kitty's cousins, who are the sons and daughters of her Uncle Gordon, who was a notorious jerk in Helena, a man who actually drove what was the remnant of the Heron-Hereford Ranch into the ground, replacing a portion of it with a trailer court, and as head of the weed control board, spraying Agent Orange and Roundup wherever he could, to the point where neighbors along the county roads were complaining that their fruit trees were dying. And Gordon said, "That's not my problem. You're not raising fruit for a living." And so I got this letter from the cousins who said, there's 5 of them, they all signed it. They said, "We deeply regret buying your book." And I thought, that's why you write these things. Yeah.
How much time did you have to go up to the state library, or could you do it from here?
I used this library to do the microfiche for the Glasgow newspapers, which weren't digitized yet. And then I used newspapers.com to do everything else. I mean, I think there are 300 newspaper citations in the book, and that's not to mention all the documents that my mother-in-law kept because she was a journalist. She hoarded everything. She had her union due stubs from working at Boeing during the war. She kept all the nasty letters she got from her husband, who abandoned the family when the son got sick. What else did she keep? She kept religious tracts sent to her by strangers because they thought she needed something to fall back on. But mostly it was the newspaper accounts. And you know, if you're, I think Christy will know, it's sometimes difficult to find primary material. I had no problems whatsoever. I mean, these 2 patriarchs were influential enough that reporters wanted to cover them. Not only that, the Heron Ranch, which was a dairy for a while, advertised every day in the Helena Independent Record. And, you know, they couldn't fart without a reporter coming out to cover it because they were spending a fortune in advertising. So this was really an easy book to write. Heidi?
There's this interesting character who I believe would have been Kitty's uncle or great uncle Heron, who became a famous float designer.
Oh yeah, this is, yeah.
And for the Rose Bowl parade, right? It was gay. He left the state. So did the family have any? Did you find? Well, you found information about him from California papers.
The LA Times covered him extensively. So Wayne got married. They had a lavish ceremony, and maybe a red flag about his homosexuality, if that is something you say now, I don't know, was that he ordered tons of flowers for the wedding ceremony. It was extravagant even by today's standards. Anyway, a couple of years after he got married, he left in the middle of the night with his lover, and they opened a flower shop in Portland, and they started designing floats for the Portland Rose Festival, I think it was, and they did very well. They also did floats for the Seattle Sea Fest, and they decided at one point they were being so successful at designing floats, they moved to Pasadena and started designing floats for the Rose Bowl parade. And they won Best in Show year after year, he and his partner. And the family's reaction to this was they absolutely adored him. They visited. Kitty's evil stepmother actually appeared on one of the floats at the Rose Bowl parade as a lion tamer, which I think they got it backwards. She should have been the lion. But yeah, they were an odd family in many ways. They were intolerant. They were Republican. Gordon was an extreme right-wing Republican, Kitty's uncle. Her other forebears not quite as extreme, although people in Montana didn't like foreigners. They didn't like Catholics. They didn't like Romanians especially. Holly made sure that he hired foreign workers, maybe because he could pay them less or pay them under the table. So they were tolerant to that extent. They're also tolerant of their gay son. And they were very proud of him. They bragged about it all the time. If the neighbors gave them grief about his homosexuality, I didn't see any account of that.
For those of us not from Montana, whereabouts does this book take place?
This takes place in what I think is the heart of Montana, the heartland. It's the Missouri River, basically from Great Falls, well, I'm going the wrong way, from Three Forks to Great Falls. And some big dams were built on the Missouri, Hauser Dam, Holter Dam, Canyon Ferry Dam. So it's a series of huge lakes connected with, flow of the Missouri River.
Kind of like Lake Sakakawea in North Dakota.
Yeah, exactly. But these were built for hydroelectric power, and those big works public dams on the Missouri were built for flood control, and later they electrified them to justify the expense.
Do you think that these kinds of actions influence the amount of cattle ranching versus sheep ranching in the state?
During the period between 1910 and 1924, wool was the dominant industry in Montana. Before that, it was cattle that they were shipping by train to the East Coast. But especially during World War I, wool was an absolute necessary commodity for the war effort. It wasn't just, you're fighting in trenches, and if you couldn't keep warm, you're not going to be an effective soldier. And wool is pretty much all they had. Cotton was useless during World War I because it just didn't keep you warm enough. So Holly made a fortune shipping, not sheep, but wool back east to basically textile mills in Boston, where it was transformed into uniforms. And then he never did give up the cattle operation, though, because people need to eat. But it was really wool that made him a fortune. And it's interesting that the wool industry is starting to come back in Montana in a kind of a boutique way. You have this great merino wool that is washable, and there's several companies that are trying to actually attract enough investors to build a textile mill or several in Montana, so that this resource stays here and they can keep every cent that they have invested in it.
You have another project?
Another project. Well, yeah, I can share this with you. Writing fiction for me has been impossible, and probably for a lot of people. But writing nonfiction is also a challenge. So right now I finished writing a proposal for a nonfiction book, and it's almost like writing the book itself. I mean, it's 35,000 words. That's just the proposal. And the agent has it. He's going to submit it next week. Hard to say where it will go. This is a history of the Indian boarding school problem in Canada and the United States. And why is a white guy from Ireland writing about Indians? Well, that's a good question. I do have a connection with a mission boarding school in Montana. And if any of you have heard of this, please raise your hand. It's called St. Peter's Mission. That's interesting, yeah. St. Peter's Mission was a pair of huge boarding schools built from quarried shonkonite. And if you know what that is, it kind of looks like chocolate chip cookies. It's a lava-based stone that's so adamant it just seems indestructible. This mission was run by the Jesuits and the Ursuline nuns basically between 1880 and 1918, 1880 and 1918, right? There were two huge boarding schools built. They looked like fortresses. One was for Indian girls, Métis, Gros Ventre, and Blackfeet girls, and the other was for the boys. They brought in teachers. The Jesuits basically made the nuns do all the work, especially the teaching work. And this is part of that whole Indian residential boarding school problem that's now just starting to percolate to the surface. And what I'm arguing in this book is that the Vatican should liquidate all of its property immediately and turn that wealth back to the tribes to start with. For example, on the Flathead Reservation, for the tribe to start buying out willing sellers to return as much of the land as possible to the tribes, communally, not individually. So that basically is what I'm working on. So St. Peter's was between Cascade and Sims, out in the middle of nowhere in the foothills of the Rockies. When you go there, it's an astounding experience because you enter this valley, and it's ringed with buttes, and the names of the buttes are what they look like. There's Haystack, there's Skull, there's one called the Bird Tail, and it's absolutely weird to be there. And then you drive down the valley, and there is, in the middle of this field infested by rattlesnakes, significant ruins. There's a wall, there's a pile of rubble. Across the road is another pile of rubble and a wall. There's the little whitewashed log church that my great-grandfather built, Thomas Moran, a little Irishman from Waterford. And he was St. Peter's caretaker throughout its existence there. And there's a cemetery there. And my great-grandfather, Thomas, is buried under a headstone about this high, a white granite or white marble headstone. The last time I was over there, a badger had burrowed right down into his casket. So that's my connection. And, thinking about, well, yeah, probably Native Americans should be writing this book, and they will. There will be different aspects of this problem because it is going to be a huge issue. And, I thought, if I'm reading a Native American's take on the Indian boarding school thing, I'm going to assume that it's going to be probably more biased than I'm going to want to read. And I'm trying with this proposal to look forward a little bit and talk about the reservations going forward, because there are real signs of progress. And if they can get the money from the churches and the Vatican to restore their land as much as they can, I think that's also a hopeful thing. On most of these reservations, you have immersion schools for indigenous languages. I think that's a good sign. You have on the Blackfeet Reservation, you have a greenhouse and a whole farming business that's trying to restore the native plants that have never, lost their allure for the Blackfeet. One of the interesting plants that they're growing is a plant that induces abortion. And so they're waiting for the Republican legislature to, I suppose, invade the reservation, burn out all this evil weed.
Why fiction versus nonfiction?
Why?
Why are you doing nonfiction for that story?
Why would you? Oh, there's no reason. It has to be nonfiction for this story. Is that what you're asking? No. I'm sorry. I said it's as the people actually know how to write fiction like it's not that easy anymore to get it published, and so I've written I think 3 novels that. One was actually well reviewed in Missoula. I published it myself, and they reviewed it anyway. The other one was so weird, it's languishing somewhere. And the third one I haven't submitted to anyone yet. And also, fiction isn't going to pay much of anything, unless you're Ann Tyler.
So I have a question about your other book. Did you let any of the family know you were going to write this story? And
Yeah, I showed drafts of it to Kitty's 4 sisters, all of whom shared my opinion of the men in their family, by and large. And so I was encouraged by that. And one of the sisters said, well, it's good, but it's not mean enough. You need to find some more dirt. The problem with the family is that Kitty's father abandoned them, ran off with a woman who also abandoned her family. That was children. Kitty's brother was dying of a brain tumor at the time. There was a certain animosity that the sisters had. So Kitty's older sister, when she found out I was going to do this, she said, don't portray the book as revenge. I said, okay, how should I portray it? The way it was, it's an homage to our mother. And I said, well, that's exactly right, yeah. What I had the most fun with doing this book were the Supreme Court cases, which are, one of them is an appendix. I love reading court cases. I love crime stuff. My wife and I, Kitty, started every day looking at the mugshots in the detention facility. And we've profiled the people that are there. For the men, they're vampires. There are hoots. Well, that's kind of derogatory, isn't it? That would be a man with just a beard down here but no mustache. There are thugs. There are, what, Bob? Do you have Hutterite relatives? Okay. Yes, right. And then the women, there are Britneys. Those are obviously crazy women who shouldn't be in jail, but they're there anyway. There's Morticias, usually kind of long, black-haired miscreants. And there are Heathers who are just mean girls. You could just look at them and say, that is a mean girl.
does the Holly name, is it well known enough that people will read the book, that it kind of transcends?
No. No, the Herons are a completely forgotten clan. If you're a lawyer, you will know who Heron is because the case law is full of his lawsuits. The other lawsuit that he pursued and won was Heron v. Sieben. If you're Montana, you know about the Sieben Ranch. Well, Holly sued Henry Sieben because he claimed that Henry was herding his sheep across Holly's land and ate at least $2,000 worth of grass. And it actually, the herons established several precedents in Montana law. This one is still in effect. And it is that you cannot corner, you can't cross from a piece of public land to another piece of public land by stepping over the corner. Because what you've done is you've invaded the airspace above the corner, and it's still illegal in Montana to do that. And that's another part of the hell to heaven doctrine. When you're a landowner in Montana, you own everything from outer space to, I assume, the center of the earth, where your property values will conflict with some Chinese person's property values, I suppose. I guess the devil would have to adjudicate that in devil's court or something. So that rule is still in effect. The other effect of Holly's litigious nature was another heron rule, which was you as a landowner own all the land between the low water marks of a navigable stream. That was overturned in the 1970s or 1984 when Dennis Michael Curran decided to string barbed wire across the Dearborn River and decapitate floaters or whatever he was trying to do. The Supreme Court ruled that the Dearborn is a navigable stream, and according to the Montana Constitution, if you want to recreate on that stream, Dennis Curran has no right to prevent you from floating on the river and using everything up to the high water mark. That changed it. That was the streamside access law. And so that the Dennis Curran tried to use the heron rule in his defense and failed. The heron rule is now defunct. But yeah, you'll see his name in case law all over the place.
So how did you define your reader?
The only readers I really cared about was Kitty's evil stepmother. She died before the book was published. So there goes my reader.
Has Helena weighed in, the independent record?
No, it's really weird because it's dedicated to the reporters, most of whom were independent record reporters. And when it hadn't been mentioned or reviewed after a couple of months, I contacted the lead newspaper general editor in Billings and kind of pled with him, you really need to, for the sake of people in Helena, you need to mention this book, I think, and read it. I mean, I didn't write this book for money. It's not going to make any money. I mean, the advance was $500, which we spend in booze in a week. I mean, it did nothing for us. And he said, well, I'll look into it. Nothing ever happened. They never reviewed the book. And as far as anyone knows, over there it doesn't exist. And maybe they read it and said, I think this is just going to piss off a lot of people in Helena. Maybe we shouldn't wade into that.
So I know you published it after Kitty's mom passed away, but did you have any inkling of writing it before she died, and did you tell her?
No, after she died, she lived with us for 7 years. She had really severe dementia the last couple years. After she died, I started going through her papers, sorting things out, seeing what the sisters wanted, what we should keep, and came across a family account of Holly Heron, and there are several things about it that just didn't jibe. But it was interesting enough. I mean, the guy at one point owned extensive property along the lake and the river, and at some point, this account said he owned 20,000 sheep. That's a lot of sheep. And that he lost the Oxbow, what became the Oxbow Ranch, because he came home and his second wife was in bed with his banker. And that's what the account said. Of course, there's no way to verify any of this. Well, whatever. These are interesting stories. Maybe I should just poke around and see what's there. And he was astounded by how much information was just low-hanging fruit. And I thought, well, it's not a bestseller. It's not something a lot of people are going to read. But, Shirley Heron might read it. And that's going to make it worth it. Anything else?
I know some writers that go back and forth between their fiction and nonfiction, kind of for balance and
Uh-huh.
also for refreshment. What's your relationship between your fiction?
That's interesting because when I was writing Hawthorne, I was also writing this ludicrous science fiction book, and one kind of balanced out the other. It was kind of fun to do one, and then it's just kind of like, like Neil knows, it's kind of fun to write, even if you have to stand up to do it. But it's also fun to go out and do physical work, and then you get tired of that, and you come back in and stand at the place and do the work of writing.
Kim Zupan puts it best. Writing's easy. You just stare at that screen until drops of blood.
Yeah, well, anyway, so if you're a writer, I recommend doing both. I mean, the fiction's, for a lot of us, isn't going to go anywhere, but, nonfiction book, like I did a reading a couple of days ago with the biographer of Bernard DeVoto, an absolutely forgotten writer, but at the time, the best writer in America, the most famous writer in America. I mean, I read his book and I thought, wow, this is why people write nonfiction, because it's just such a good flow, and it's so lively and just as good as fiction, and the stories are so wonderful. Okay, well, thanks for coming.